Well, now to tonight's guest, defence commentator and retired United States Naval Commander Harlan Ullman is a member of the Strategic Advisors Group at the Atlantic Council and a senior fellow at the National Defence University. It was Harlan Ullman who developed the shock and awe military strategy used in the opening phase of the Iraq War, a war which he opposed. He joins us now from Washington. Thanks for being there.
Good evening, Tony.
Now, it's being said that President Obama is trying for a triple play to find solutions to the crises in Iraq and Iran, as well as the Israel-Palestine conflict. Is he overreaching here?
I think that he is not only overreaching, but he has missed a grand opportunity. His speech last night, as some of your viewers might have heard, was divided into three parts, first about Iraq, then about Afghanistan, and then about the future. And unfortunately, in each part of the speech, he failed to mention or discuss some of the ticking time bombs. For example, in Iraq, as the American military withdraws, we are going to be militarizing our civilians who are going to be added in number, making the State Department, in essence, a tiny little army with a lot of security guards, its own helicopters. And I don't think that's going to work necessarily. In Afghanistan, the president still talks about going after al-Qaeda as our main mission, when in fact it's really stabilization and trying to put in place good governance. And as for the future, the president really didn't come up with any specifics except a pledge to the American public that we're going to do better. It seemed to me that last night's speech could have been better framed if he focused on the future and his main priorities, the economy, winding down the wars, and trying to bring some degree of peace to the Middle East. He didn't do that for whatever reasons, and I think it was an opportunity lost. But the answer to your question is, at this stage, I'm afraid we're overstretched for a lot of reasons, some of which are not very good ones.
Harlan, what does this tell you about his advisors? Because there's no shortage of ambition in their statement. So let's take his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, who made some remarkable statements about this triple play. In a recent interview, he said, these are the three big chess pieces, and in each of the places we're poised for success. I mean, what's he basing this on? It sounds like hubris.
I would say if I were making a bet, I'd go short on that prediction. I'd go short in a very big way. The problem is, I think, that Obama's closest circle is really entirely politically oriented. That's Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff, David Axelrod, his chief strategist, and Valerie Jarrett. But none of them have any real experience when it comes to governance or to foreign policy. And I think that things in this Obama administration are too heavily weighed in terms of ideology and in terms of political meaning. Let me give you one example. In the case of the economy, Obama is out to strengthen the middle class and build the middle class. But to do that, he's going to try and reduce the wealthier class, when in fact it seems to me he should be trying to lift all Americans. But it's the ideology of building the middle class rather than moving towards prosperity that I think is a mistake in his case.
But we do keep hearing optimistic assessments, not only from Rahm Emanuel and others, but from more experienced advisors like Dennis Ross, who says there's a genuine political process underway in Iraq. He does seem to be ignoring 6 months of bitter infighting, no government since the election, and this incredible upsurge in violence from the insurgents.
Dennis is part of the administration, and obviously he's going to follow the party line. The two people, or the three people who I think have taken a more balanced view are Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mike Mullen, and General Dave Petraeus. I think they have laid out a lot of the difficulties. They haven't overstated them, but I think that they've been balanced. But I think the administration, just like it predicted that unemployment was going to be down to 8% and that gross domestic product would be increasing by 3 or 4% in terms of their economic projections, they were entirely wrong, and I don't see any grounds, I'm sorry to say, for the optimism that's being projected. But it's understandable. Any White House wants to spin things, especially as the peace talks get underway in Washington today between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So obviously that's true, but I think you have to take a look at it with a very, very, very small grain of salt.
Okay, let's look closer at those peace talks you've just mentioned. What are the chances that they are, as Rahm Emanuel suggests, poised for success?
After Winston Churchill was rejected from Parliament in 1945, his wife Clementine said, "This may be a blessing in disguise," to which Churchill replied, "If indeed it is a blessing, it is well disguised." I don't see any grounds for optimism. I'm amazed that actually they brought the talks together. maybe below the surface there's a lot of pressure being applied, but the fact of the matter is that Palestine is divided between Fatah and Hamas, with Hamas on control in Gaza, that the head of the Palestinian Authority is very, very weak, and the Israeli government is divided with a very strong right wing. So under those circumstances, and given Iran and Syria's support of Hezbollah, it seems to me exceedingly difficult for some kind of breakthrough to be made unless the United States is prepared to pay a huge political price, which means really leaning heavily on both the Palestinians and the Israelis and being prepared to insert, if necessary, American, NATO, or peacekeeping forces to maintain the peace, something I think that no American president is prepared to do at this stage.
Including President Obama, because, I mean, that's straight out of the script of The West Wing. It's entirely what happened with President Bartlett, who one imagines would be a bit of a model for Obama.
I suspect he is, but that's, of course, fiction, and this is reality. I think it would be very hard-pressed to send any number of thousands of Americans into Israel or Palestine when we're withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan, and we certainly will be drawing down from Afghanistan. But our U.S. military is hugely overstretched. I think they've become targets, and quite frankly, given the circumstances, I don't think it would work at this stage.
We've seen the killings overnight in the West Bank of 4 settlers,
Sure,
including a pregnant woman, horrifyingly enough, by Hamas militants. I mean, this just underlines what you were talking about earlier, which is that Hamas, which controls Gaza, is not even a part of these talks. How can you actually have peace talks without such a significant player being involved and, in fact, being antagonistic to them?
That's a good point, Tony, and I think that's one of the constraints. Clearly, this leads back to Iran, Syria, Hezbollah. Now, one of the things that could be a breakthrough, but I don't think this administration is prepared to do it, is to return the Golan to Syria in exchange for a peace treaty with Israel. I think at this stage this is a bridge too far because of Syria's support of Hezbollah in Lebanon. But the fact of the matter is some kind of triangular diplomacy like that could lead to a breakthrough. But at this stage, there are no signs that any of that is happening. It may well be because it would be kept very sensitive and very confidential. But based on what one can see in the public record and what's happening, the talks are getting underway. That's good. But it seems to me it's going to be a very, very long time between these talks prove anything productive. I hope that's a mistake on my part, but I wouldn't put a lot of money on the success coming out of this, except the fact that they are talking.
There is another imperative to getting these peace talks underway right now, and that is that the current Israeli freeze on settlements expires in 3 weeks' time. And if settlement activity begins, or building activity begins again, there is no chance of any peace settlement of any kind, even with the moderates. Isn't that so?
That's correct, Tony.
And so what do you think is going to happen then? Because even as a result of today's events, the killings, there's been a restarting on a limited scale of some building activity.
Well, to be perfectly direct, I think that the real issue is not going to play out in Palestine or Israel. It's going to play out in Pakistan. This is the most strategically consequential catastrophe we've had. Imagine in the United States if everything from New York to New Orleans east of the Mississippi were underwater. What you have in Pakistan is, as I said, a strategic catastrophe because the Pakistan military is not going to be able to support what it's doing in the West in Afghanistan. Rebuilding that country is essential. We're not putting in enough aid, and you could see Pakistan implode in the next 3, 4, 5, or 6 months. That becomes a huge disaster, which would overshadow everything else. And at this stage, the administration is regarding it only as a humanitarian crisis. I think if it were my priority, this would be number one, way ahead of everything else, because if Pakistan really cannot control what's going on, and look what we did in New Orleans after Katrina, if the United States government, which is probably decades or centuries ahead of Pakistan in terms of modernity, if the Americans couldn't do it over Katrina, what chance do the Pakistanis have? And if that becomes the case, you're going to see instability, you're going to see violence, you're going to see disease. You could see what happened in 1970 in East Pakistan when the floods caused such riots that ultimately there was a war with India and East Pakistan became Bangladesh. That's a consequence potentially we could be following, and I'm afraid we've not put enough attention on it right now.
Well, you're saying essentially that this foreign policy triple play is missing a far bigger problem. But let me go to the third part of that triple play, which is Iran, and that's the other unintended legacy of the Iraq War, obviously, is the rise of the influence of Iran and its leadership in the region. Obama has managed to put together a new package of sanctions. They appear to be much tougher, but sanctions haven't really worked in the past. Will they work this time?
No, they will not. They will make life a little bit more difficult. What we need to do is to try to encourage particularly Russia and China and other countries to lean on Iran to get the IAEA back in and to do whatever we can. And if the Iranians are not prepared to stand down in their nuclear ambitions, if they are going to build a weapon, we better putting in a plan B, because the only way that we can stop that, or I should say defer it, is through some kind of a military attack. And I think at this stage, if that were to occur, the consequences would be far worse than even a nuclear-armed Iran. So I think the administration needs to review its policies, but it's got so much on its plate, and it is declaring that it did achieve its campaign promise in Iraq. It's looking at Afghanistan to try and begin a withdrawal sometime next year, but it certainly is overloaded. When you asked the original question about overstretching, the fact of the matter is we probably have more difficult foreign policy problems as well as domestic problems on our plate than any administration or government can handle. So this is a bridge too far in too many directions, Tony.
Harlan Ullman, on that bleak note, we'll have to leave you. It's always good to speak to you. We thank you very much for joining us tonight on Lateline.
Tony, my pleasure.